Why do we feel empty after a deep spiritual experience? Is an awakening supposed to bring us light, peace, and clarity? Then why, instead of feeling more alive, do we find ourselves paralyzed, confused, as if our motivation had been ripped out from the root? It's a puzzling paradox. What many seek as the summit of the soul, spiritual awakening, is often followed by a silent fall. There's no longer a desire to chase success, no hunger for validation, no excitement for what once felt so urgent. What used to drive us now feels distant, absurd, lifeless. Goals dissolve like fog under the sun, and in their place remains a deep, almost unbearable silence, as if the inner engine that once pushed us so strongly had suddenly shut down. The question is inevitable: what's happening inside us? Carl Jung, one of the great explorers of the human soul, warned that this feeling isn't a mistake or a malfunction. It's not that something is going wrong, it's that something real is finally happening. Spiritual awakening, far from being a destination, is the threshold to a much more complex and demanding transformation, the confrontation with oneself. And in that process, everything that once seemed important begins to shake. Ordinary motivation, built on the ego, dissolves. Because that ego, that we thought we were, that identity fed by approval, achievement, and image, begins to die. And like all deaths, this one comes with grief. No one prepares us for that. No one warns us that looking directly at the soul might cause us to lose interest in the world as we once knew it. That what used to wake us up in the morning, duty, desire, ambition, now seems like a meaningless play. That opening our spiritual eyes also means seeing the shadow, not just the light. Jung was clear about this. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that doesn't inspire, at least not right away. At first, it disorients, disarms, and stops us. That's why many people who've had a real spiritual experience, who've passed through that crack where the light enters, later feel empty, immobile. Not because they're lost, but because they can no longer walk in the same shoes. Because something inside them has broken, and the old world no longer fits in that fracture. They can no longer push themselves like they used to. They can no longer be motivated by superficial rewards. But they haven't yet found the new language the soul speaks. It's like waking up in a foreign land with no map, no signs, no voice. What was once home now feels strange. What once sparked passion now brings indifference. But inside, something softly burns. A calling. A subtle vibration that has no shape yet. It is the self, that deeper instance Jung described as the true core of our being, beginning to emerge. But it doesn't impose. It doesn't command. It doesn't make promises. It only whispers. And those whispers cannot compete with the world's screams. They don't generate adrenaline or instant dopamine. They don't serve a race against time. That's why, in a culture that idolizes productivity, this phase of awakening can seem dangerous, even pathological. Someone who no longer wants to climb, to stand out, to prove themselves, aren't they depressed? Haven't they lost their way? But maybe it's not a loss, but a redirection. Maybe it's not a fall, but a germination. Because in truth, motivation hasn't vanished. What has died is the shallow, reactive motivation imposed from the outside. What has been born, though we may not yet recognize it, is the space for a deeper, slower, truer motivation. One that doesn't push, but pulls. One not based on the fear of failure, but on the longing to be authentic. But this new motivation, at first, feels like nothing. Like silence. Like emptiness. And that's scary. The ego can't stand the void. It fills it with urgency. It covers it with tasks, goals, distractions. But the soul works differently. The soul needs space, stillness, fertile ground. And that ground is often exhaustion. Existential fatigue. Surrender. What Jung called the dark night of the soul isn't a mistake on the spiritual path. It's a required step. It's the necessary descent to reconnect with the root, to remember who we are without the masks. And in that descent, it's natural for motivation as we knew it to disappear. Because we didn't come into this world to fulfill a checklist. We came here to be. And being, as Jung understood it, is a deep, organic process that requires integrating everything: light and shadow, reason and instinct, desire and fear. In that process, motivation returns. But not as an ego-driven force. It returns as a response from the soul. True motivation is not a force that drags us. It's an inner melody that resonates with who we are. And you can't hear that melody while you're running. It reveals itself when you are still, when you stop pretending, when you stop forcing yourself. So if today you feel drained, aimless, desireless, maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're awakening. Maybe you're leaving behind a life that wasn't yours, and you haven't yet discovered the one that is. It's a passage, a gestation. And like all gestations, it's quiet, uncertain, full of doubts, but also full of power. Jung didn't promise a happy life. He promised a real one, a meaningful life. And meaning takes time to arrive. Because it can't be bought, can't be found outside, can't be inherited. It must be discovered, cultivated, built from within. And even if it first feels like a desert, that's the beginning of the true journey. So if you've ever felt like your awakening robbed you of motivation, breathe. You're not alone. You're not broken. You're passing through the most honest and challenging part of the path. The moment when the soul starts to speak, and for the first time, you have no idea what to say back. But you will. Because even if it doesn't seem like it now, that too is part of awakening. The loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is not a detour. It's an integral part of the process. When one begins to awaken, what's really happening is a break from a former way of being. It's as if the stage we'd been performing on our whole life crumbles, and suddenly we find ourselves behind the curtain, seeing everything with new eyes. Enlightenment, as many describe it, isn't a glorious burst of perpetual happiness. Often, it's a quiet disillusionment, and that can hurt. It hurts to realize that many of our aspirations were built on someone else's expectations. That our sense of duty, our goals, even our deepest desires, were largely responses to the external voices that educated us, shaped us, directed us. It hurts to see how much of what used to drive us was an unconscious strategy to avoid pain, loneliness, abandonment, fear of failure. And when those strategies fall away, what's left isn't excitement, it's a disorienting emptiness. We don't know who we are without them. Carl Jung called it the process of individuation, the return to oneself, stripped of masks. But that return is not a triumphant march. It's more like a slow, sometimes bitter fall into the unknown. The soul begins to reclaim the space once occupied by the ego. And the soul doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't seduce with rewards. The soul whispers, waits, watches. And we, used to living in a rush, don't know what to do with that waiting. It's easy to mistake that waiting for apathy, for depression, for loss. And sometimes, yes, it looks like that. Because at a very deep level, we are in mourning. Mourning for the person we no longer are, even though we don't yet know who we're becoming. It's like an inner death. We no longer believe in what we once believed. We no longer trust what used to excite us. We no longer crave what once kept us awake at night. And yet, we have nothing new to replace it. There's a barren ground between what is dying and what is being born. A silent interval where everything seems lifeless. And in that interval, it's natural to feel that life has lost its flavor, its purpose, its direction. But it's precisely there that the real journey begins. That's where the soul can finally begin to speak without interference. Jung spoke of confronting the shadow, that repressed part of ourselves we buried under achievements, routines, and social roles. Spiritual awakening, despite how mystical it sounds, is often just that, recognizing that we are much more, and also much less, than we thought we were. It's facing our contradictions, our oldest fears, our unhealed wounds. And that doesn't automatically inspire. It demands. It breaks us open. Conventional motivation is linear. It's based on goals, on outcomes, on promises. But once you awaken, you realize you no longer want goals that pull you away from the present. That chasing outcomes has become exhausting, even absurd. And that the world's promises are nothing more than sophisticated illusions. So then, how do you live without that? At first, you just live however you can. Some days, just getting out of bed is an act of courage. Days when nothing excites you, and yet something quietly pushes from within. A kind of love without an object. A vague but real longing. It's not a clear motivation with a name and a destination. It's a silent pull asking you simply to be present. Not to do. Just to be. And in our culture, that's almost a crime. To not produce, to not advance, to not shine. What's the point of existing then? But that's exactly where the deepest transformation happens. Because the soul doesn't measure in achievements. It measures in authenticity, in presence, in connection. And for that, sometimes, we must pass through the deepest silence. There is something almost sacred in that silence. Something that, if we manage to endure without escaping, begins to reveal its meaning. Not immediately, not clearly, but deeply. Little by little, what once motivated us reveals itself for what it was, a way of running. And what now slows us down begins to take on a new color, no longer stagnation, but rooting. No longer apathy, but rest. No longer loss, but preparation. Preparation for what? We don't know yet, but the soul knows. It knows something is germinating, even if it has no visible form. And in that process, every day we resist the old urge to fill the emptiness with urgency, we come closer to reconnecting with what truly matters. Jung was no prophet of quick fixes. He was a craftsman of the soul. And as such, he reminded us that the path to oneself is not walked in a rush. It's walked by listening, by honoring each stage, even the ones that seem barren, especially those. Because it's there, in the apparent desert, that the new begins to bloom. And the new doesn't look like what we expected. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shine. It doesn't promise fame or success. The new, when it comes, is gentle, serene. It's the desire to write even if no one reads, to care for a plant, to listen to music while doing nothing else, to hug someone without hurrying, to walk with no destination. And though they may seem like small things, they are signs that a new kind of motivation is being born, one that needs no approval, no explanation, no rush. It's a motivation that comes from the soul, not the ego. And because of that, it's slower, deeper, freer. It doesn't seek to impose, or to prove, or to impress. It simply seeks to express. And in that expression, it finds meaning. Not a defined, fixed, measurable meaning, but a living, changing, open one. A meaning that doesn't come from outside, but from within. Maybe that's the hardest part to accept, that the motivation we once knew must die so that a truer one can be born. That silence is part of the soul's language. That emptiness is not a sign of failure, but of growth. That we are not here to race, we are here to awaken. And awakening, while beautiful, hurts at first. Because it means letting go of what we no longer are, even if we don't yet know who we will become. But if we have the courage to cross that threshold, without clinging, without turning back, without desperately trying to fill the void, we'll discover something unexpected, that within the emptiness lives a seed. And that seed, with time and silence, begins to sprout. That seed is our true voice, our true motivation, the one that needs no embellishment, no promises. The one that simply tells us, from the deepest place, keep going. No rush, no goal, just go on. Because being alive, in and of itself, is already reason enough. And what if, after all, it wasn't about always being motivated, but about learning to stay awake? Awake in the middle of the silence. Awake in the midst of doubt. Awake even when all we feel is that warm weight of not knowing where we're going. Because sometimes the greatest act of clarity is to accept that we don't have answers. That motivation, as we once knew it, might never return. And that's okay. We were taught to see life as a staircase, always climbing, always moving forward. But the soul doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in spirals, in cycles, in its own rhythms. Sometimes it pauses to breathe, to cry, to empty itself. Sometimes it retreats not because it's broken, but because it needs silence to be reborn. And in that silence, in that pause that makes us so uncomfortable, the deepest alchemy may be taking place. Not visible from the outside, not celebrated by anyone, but absolutely vital. It's easy to crave clarity. We want to feel driven, decisive, full of enthusiasm for the day ahead. We want to have a why that embraces us when we wake up. But when that why disappears, it's not the end. It's the beginning of another way of living. One in which we no longer need to be useful to feel worthy. One in which we no longer depend on recognition, or achievements, or even desire. One in which we simply are. We breathe. And that's enough. Maybe that's the great lesson of awakening. Not that everything becomes clearer, but that we learn to dwell in the fog with dignity. We learn to walk without certainty, guided only by a fragile yet deep intuition, like an ember that never fully goes out. An ember that doesn't shout what to do, but silently reminds us that we are alive. And that being alive is, in itself, a miracle. Because haven't we been running from ourselves this whole time? Chasing goals, distractions, relationships that offered us something we thought we needed. And now that the masks have fallen, now that there's no noise separating us from what matters, why not pause to listen? Maybe we don't have motivation, but we do have presence. And that is infinitely more powerful. Jung knew that the soul speaks in symbols, not action plans. Its language isn't productivity, it's depth. And that's why, when we wake up, what we need most isn't to speed up, but to slow down. Not to plan, but to feel. Not to fight to feel enthusiastic again, but to open ourselves to the mystery of who we are when there is no enthusiasm. Because in that mystery often lies the truth we've always avoided, that we are not what we do, nor what we achieve, nor what we desire. We are what remains when all of that fades. And what remains is greater than we imagine. It doesn't show up on social media, isn't rewarded in universities, doesn't trade on the market, but it carries the weight of the eternal, the weight of the real. That's something that beats in our chest without name or shape but reminds us that we belong. Not to a system, not to success, not even to a spiritual path. We belong to life, to wholeness, to mystery. Learning to trust in that belonging, even when we don't know where it leads, is one of the bravest things we can do. Because it means accepting that we are not in control. That we never were. That everything we thought we were managing was just a fragile illusion to avoid the vertigo of existing. And still, when we let go of control, we don't fall. We discover that something holds us. Something that doesn't depend on us, yet lives within us. That feeling, not motivation, but something deeper, is what slowly begins to guide us. It doesn't push. It doesn't rush. It simply invites. Invites us to walk a little further. To stay a little longer in the land of not knowing. To trust that the soul isn't lost, just transforming. And like all living things, it needs time. Living this way isn't easy. Not in this world. Not when everything tells us we must move forward, produce, and have a clear reason for everything we do. But if we can resist that pressure, if we can stay still a little longer, we'll begin to discover something that can't be seen in a rush, that we are being reconfigured from within. That silence is shaping a new way of being. That the loss of old motivation is the necessary space for a new one to arise. Not like a firework, but like a patient ember. One that burns from truth. And when that new motivation appears, it doesn't come with banners. It doesn't announce itself. One day, we simply wake up and feel that we want to write, not to publish, but to say something to ourselves. That we want to go for a walk, not to get somewhere, but to inhabit our body. That we want to be with someone, not to fill a void, but to share the silence. And in those small things, we realize the soul has started speaking to us again. It was never gone, just quiet, waiting for us to stop yelling. Then we understand, we didn't lose motivation. We lost the disguise of what we thought was motivation. And that, far from being a tragedy, is a blessing. Because what now moves us doesn't need a stage. Doesn't need to be shown. It just needs to be lived. With humility. With surrender. With love. And so, in that quiet space where the soul breathes freely, we discover something no one ever taught us. That we don't have to feel like it to live. That we don't need enthusiasm to be present. That we don't need to know where we're going to walk with an open heart. We only need to be. And in times of so much noise, that is more than enough. What looks like a lack of motivation is, more often than not, the soul saying, "You're finally home. Stop doing. Just be." And if we can embrace that message, even on gray days, even when everything feels still, we'll begin to feel a different kind of energy. More stable. More faithful. Not a high that rises and falls. A peace that stays. It's not easy, but it's real. And in a world that runs on appearances, reality, no matter how quiet, is the greatest gift. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are waking up. And sometimes, waking up feels a lot like being tired. But it's just the soul adjusting to its new form. Give it time. Give it silence. And you'll see that in that nameless space, something begins to grow. Something that no longer needs reasons, because it has found meaning.